Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Delavan, and joining me as always is our producer, Chelsea Steer.
Hey, Sarah. I thought we could do something a little different today at the top of the show. I'm sure many of our listeners know at this point that we talk about ratings and reviews right of the podcast. And when you leave a rating or a review of the podcast, wherever you listen, it is the number one way that we get this show to more founders, which is really our big mission, right? To get this information out to as many people as possible. And so I thought it would be fun to actually read one of our reviews today on the show.
That's a great idea. I love that.
Okay. So this one actually comes from Captain Kim 90 on Apple Podcasts. And Captain Kim says, "Loving this podcast, so full of valuable information. Sarah speaks directly and thoughtfully and asks her knowledgeable guests great questions for the listeners. So impressed with this podcast and the value each weekly episode delivers."
That is such a nice review. And I'm going to go ahead and give a little shout out to Bake Up by Kim on the podcast. It's an amazing local bakery in Southern California. And it's nice to hear her thoughts on the show. So thank you, Kim. And thank you, Chelsea, for reading that. That was really fun.
Yeah. So today on the show, we are actually airing a conversation that you had with Errol Schweizer. And I'm really excited about this because Errol is someone that we have been wanting to get on the podcast for a while now. We follow his articles. We've been sharing them around the office for a while now. And actually, that his articles are what really inspired us to have a news segment on the podcast.
Yeah, I remember passing around, like you said, sharing articles back and forth. And there was a moment in time where I was like, all of these articles are written by the same guy. And it was like, I need to find out who Errol is. I need to learn more about him and his experience. And he just is so intelligent and so experienced. And, I think we're going to link to all the articles we mentioned in our conversation in the show notes. I highly encourage you to go and read them and check out his podcast as well, which is called The Checkout. It's just really in line with a lot of the things we talk about around here in terms of changing the food industry, what's broken in the food industry, equitability throughout the food industry. And Errol, as an industry veteran, like he has been a part of the food industry for over 25 years at this point. He has a lot of notable, roles and successes throughout his career. And one of the more notable is that he was the VP of grocery for Whole Foods from 2009 to 2016. Obviously, that was when Whole Foods was a bit different than it is today. And Errol shares what it was like then to really be a part of launching brands that were organic and, sustainable back at that time. The things that they did, the strategies that they had in place and how things have changed since then, but also why. It's just really interesting to hear his insights. And as you noted before we started recording here today, Chelsea, there's not a lot we want to cut out of this episode. We want the listeners to really hear the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that what was so great about this conversation, as you kind of already mentioned, that you guys are really getting into the food industry, what is broken, equitability, and talking about like what can be done. But I think that with the experience that Errol brings to that conversation, you guys got very specific.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just enthralling to listen to. I know I'm not the only one that feels that way. We've got some members on our team that were like, I don't know what you're going to do to cut that episode down. So with that being said, we decided to just skip our news segment today and really get right into the conversation.
I think that's a great idea. But like one more thing before we do that is I encourage you, as I said before, go to the show notes, check out the Forbes articles and other articles that Errol has written. And in addition to that, check out his full bio, which is listed there. Check out his full list of credentials and also what he's up to currently. All right, shall we get to it?
Yeah, let's jump in. Do you want more from the Good Food CFO? Join our newsletter. When you sign up for the Good Food CFO newsletter, you'll get updates from us about the podcast, what's happening in the Good Food CFO community, articles from the Good Food CFO herself, Sarah Delavan, and information about the free and low-cost resources that will support you in building a business on your own terms, all delivered straight to your inbox weekly. Just visit thegoodfoodcfo.com to sign up today. And now, back to the show.
Errol, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. As I mentioned in the intro, you are the co-host of the Checkout podcast, and you're also a writer. And I think that both the podcast and your articles are essential reading for people who eat. I will say that your articles, they circulated around the Good Food CFO for probably a year before we realized, wait a second, the same guy is writing every article that we're sharing amongst ourselves. And that's when I was like, I got to learn more about Errol and what he's up to. And your article on egg pricing, which really did, I think, an amazing job of breaking down, like, how does the price of an egg end up at what it is on the retail shelf and how it differs for a top of the line organic producer versus a mass market producer, I think is, again, essential knowledge for anyone who eats and needs to, I think, understand like how that all works. So just right here from the top, I wanted to say thank you for the work that you do and for being here today to talk with me and to share some insights with our listeners.
No, I think it's a huge privilege. Admiration is mutual. Huge fan of what you do for the food industry, and just always humbled that people read my articles or listen to the podcast and actually care about what I have to say. So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you. I want to start at the beginning because I think that makes sense. You have over 25 years in the food industry, and it seems based on your bio like that you've really been in a number of different roles over the years and really worked your way kind of up and around the food system and the food industry. And I think one of the, I'll say most notable, just because I think it speaks to people, is your role as the VP of grocery at Whole Foods. And I think you held that role for over a decade. Is that right?
Between being the associate global coordinator and then, the VP of grocery was 9 years combined.
Wow.
And then I also had over a year as a regional coordinator. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in sort of how you got your start in food.
I started out in food, just flipping burgers, making sandwiches in college, working, in student dining just to, have some money, help with tuition. I was lucky enough that my dad worked a second job to help put me through college. I was the oldest of five. Yeah, I worked part-time throughout school. Oddly enough, I never really considered the food industry. I was pre-med. I studied biology, hated it, did not do well in it. Transferred a bit to environmental studies, ecology. So actually, I started out being an EMT with 2,000 ambulance hours, and then doing immunology research, and then started doing forest surveys and like being outdoors. In the meantime, started working at the campus food co-op too. This is back in the mid 90s. It was pre-silk. I'll just say that. Like, okay, there was Eden soy, but there was not yet silk for soy milk buffs. So yeah, I mean, sort of fell in by accident. When I got out of school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I worked for a series of NGOs doing community organizing. I did anti-drug law organizing with Drop the Rock. I did environmental justice work. And then I worked a series of pretty much every kind of blue collar job out there: construction, landscaping, maintenance, warehouse, retail, more food service, just kind of bouncing around. And then we had a kid, realized I needed health insurance, had to get a little more serious about it. And it was my wife suggested, why don't you go work at Whole Foods? I had grown up at a community center in the Bronx and was sort of used to this, kind of dysfunctional yet familial atmosphere. And Whole Foods really reminded me of that. And it was like, kind of like a co-op back then, 20 plus years ago. And so, yeah, I got a job there. They put me in the grocery team, which was weird because I had done a lot of work in produce and food service. They put me in the packaged side of things. And I just stuck with it and pretty much, learned the ropes from scratch. I worked really hard, obviously having a young family and wanting to actually, keep my income, and health insurance was good motivation, and just kept applying for jobs until they gave me something that was meaningful.
Yeah. So altogether, you said you were there about 9 years.
I was at Whole Foods for around 14 because I worked in several stores across a number of regions. So I started in store operations in the grocery team. I actually did work in produce too. So I've stocked plenty of wet racks and cut fruit and potato bins. But I mostly did grocery, packaged foods, refrigerated bulk, dairy, frozen. I still got most of my box cutters and most of my gloves, and I have all of my little name tag pins and business cards that I generated over the years in various roles at Whole Foods. And it was a great time to be there because there was just a lot of stores opening. There's a ton of opportunity. And even though I feel like the company didn't always treat us very well, there's always a lot of gaslighting and manipulation at, big business. I just met so many people that I loved and stayed friends with. And that's why I just stuck around. It was just like a wonderful group of people to be around back then who just believed in what they were doing.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, Whole Foods has changed since then, literally changed ownership and many other facets. I mean, I think year after year, the internal organization and how they buy and all of that kind of keeps shuffling as well. But when you were VP of Grocery, can you shed some light on what does that role entail and what were you doing?
Yeah, when I was there, and so just to date myself, I started out in regional grocery in 2007 and then moved to national in 2009 and was promoted. Actually, I was VP of grocery in 2009 is when I started in that role. So even I can't remember the dates. I apologize. The regions were really in charge of the company. It was a decentralized culture, decentralized company. There was a lot of positives about that. There was also a lot of things that were really difficult in terms of trying to create some sense of coordination and leveraging scale and efficiencies to compete on price and to create national programs while also maintaining the autonomy and the independence and the localization. And so my job was to coordinate the regional buying with the actual folks running those regions. So I was like their kind of like their crazy uncle. I wasn't their direct report. I was like their dotted line report. But it was also my job. I was responsible for the national P&L for grocery, even though I didn't have control over it, which is just bonkers.
Wow.
It's why I don't think anybody else
Yeah.
applied for the job. Because like how do you own something that you don't control? And people that worked for me thought I was crazy and said we just need a cooperative buying structure, so we need to create some level of consensus and cooperation among the regions. And that was a really hard road to hoe. That's the right metaphor. We had to keep the regions together, performing as a unit without any contractual obligation like you see in buying co-ops like NCG or Wakefern. I mean, they have contractual
Yeah.
obligations to execute those cooperative programs. With us, it was just let's get together and make decisions as a group around national programs while you can still do what you need to do to differentiate and compete in your market. And luckily I had worked in stores and I had worked and led the New York grocery region for a little over a year. So I had that experience. And in fact, the reason why I was promoted was because we had turned around New York from an underperforming region to the most profitable region within a
Oh,
little
wow.
over a year, just by implementing some of these same types of programs that we were doing: new product innovation, EDLC negotiations with larger suppliers, amped up promotions, including scan back promotions, not just off invoice or chargebacks, which we could talk about,
Right.
and a really good pipeline of innovation and renovation of what was in each of our 75 categories. So we had 75
Wow.
categories to cover. I didn't sleep that year. I worked like every day when I was in that region because I just wanted to figure out, and I also didn't want to get fired. Whole Foods is a very much that like throw you to the wolves to see how well you do. But you found a lot of people who were in similar roles at the time, a lot of trauma bonding with folks. And then, we built a lot of relationships with suppliers too, and started developing a reputation among suppliers that we were here for innovation. Our margin growth and our sales growth were really at the time determined by our innovation, not by leveraging better trade spend from Coke and Pepsi and Kellogg's. And that was there
Right.
too. That was what we were doing with EDLC, everyday low cost, but it wasn't driving the bus. It was much more defensive. In fact, we used to beat those folks up a lot on trade spend and cost in order to compete with Walmart and Wegmans and
Right.
Target, to the point where they'd end up, calling my boss or coming in with, these big national meetings like, your guys are too mean to us. Well, and there's a lot more to that too. I don't work there anymore. I have friends in the office there still. It's obviously very different. I know there's still a lot of wonderful people, who are trying to keep some of those same principles. They have a different set of goals and different ownership now with Amazon.
Right.
And they've obviously radically restructured purchasing to be highly centralized and very top down. So it's a very different organization than when I was there. And frankly, I mean, this is like fast forwarding, I wasn't going to be able to play a part in that. I sort of butted heads with some of the incoming folks, and I was asked to leave, which is, it was time, but it was a wild time to be there because we had to really thread that needle between the regional autonomy and independence and localization, and building these collaborative national programs in order to really pay the rent. I mean, we paid the rent for the whole company, grocery, gross margins and sales dollars. It was 30+% of sales and almost 35% of gross margin for the company. It was really do or die. Like it was on our shoulders, not me per se, but like our whole team of regional grocery folks at the time. It was a lot of pressure.
Can we talk about how a grocery store makes money? And I know that might be like really complicated, but I think that brands, and there are things I don't know about it, like just to be like very frank, I've never worked in I was a cashier in a family-owned grocery store when I was 15 years old, 15,
Respect.
16
I
years
couldn't
old.
do it. I couldn't be a cashier. I'm way too ADHD. I'd always be giving
I will
wrong
say
change.
oddly enough, I'm a financial consultant, but my drawer was always off. I couldn't sort out the coupons were never entered into my drawer correctly. But that was my only time in grocery was working as a cashier nights and weekends. Off season of basketball was when I was like allowed to have a job. I talk a lot about transparency here, and how the industry works, and I know that that's a huge part of what you talk about and what you're trying to educate people on. So I'm just curious how you would describe the ways in which a grocery store makes money. And I wish I had the article title here, but I know that you wrote something about trade spend and slotting fees and how they support the industry as well. I'm sure that plays a part in
How about
in
this?
how it
Why don't
works.
we give you two examples of two types
Okay.
of grocery stores, because the business models do vary, like the financial modeling, of how this all happens. And so, like, let's say you're a mass marketer, like Sarah Mart, like a big multinational chain, publicly traded. You sell not just groceries, but also hard goods, apparel, right? So you have a different business model. Like your gross margin for the Mega Mart is 25%. So that's all in. As a percent of sales, your net, margin is maybe 1%, right?
Okay.
This is a model. I mean, this is mass market. At that type of model, like a lot of the mass market chains actually don't use slotting fees. They're EDLC. Walmart is EDLC. So that means everyday low cost, everyday dead net. You give us the lowest cost, you're dead. And that's really it.
Yeah.
And anybody who does business with Walmart needs some level of scale and needs some level of competency in their cost of goods and their modeling, because they are very demanding. And Walmart even says, we better not be more than like 30% of your business, because we know at some point we're going to screw you.
Wow.
It's just a really tough business, and it favors larger suppliers, and they have some smaller brands there, emerging brands, but they have to be well capitalized. You got to have money in the bank to do that, and because they're everyday low cost, instead of doing promotions, you're giving them your lowest cost goods every day, and they're just putting it out at the lowest possible SRP. And food is like 60% of Walmart's business, I think. Don't quote me on the exact amount, but it's a big chunk. Walmart is the largest grocery chain in the US. Between Walmart and Sam's, at least 30% of grocery dollars. So this is a big model. This is the first one you need to talk about. It's the center of gravity in the grocery industry, or on a bad day, I say it's the all-consuming void, sucking us all into its depths, because they're they influence everything. And it's EDLC. And a few years back, Doug McMillon had taken Walmart off EDLC and they started doing promotions and some trade spend. But I think it was too complicated for them. They just know that like they're going after the best price every day. They're an extremely efficient, large scale, high volume operator, and they keep their labor costs very low, probably under 10% of sales. I haven't reviewed the earnings recently. And that's really low for, a food outlet, right? And then if you're a supplier, you got to give them at least 98% fill rate every day, right? So if you have 100 cases, 98 go to Walmart first, and then the other 2 get split between your other customers. So you, like, once again, need to have some level of scale. I just wanted to give the Mega Mart hypermarket focus first. Okay, now let's say you are more of a grocery store, supermarket, whether you're Sprouts or an Ahold division like Giant, or if you're on the West Coast, Raley's, Bosch's. You have a bit more of a complex model. Usually your gross margin is a bit higher. As a percent of sales, you're talking, 35 to 40%. That's what you need to do to keep the lights on, right? Your net margin, your profit is probably in that same 1 to 2% range. During COVID-19, we did see a spike in grocery profits, went well over 3%, which I've written about how that happened and why, with some of the pricing issues. But when you have that kind of model, you have to be much more conscious about how you're accessing supplier dollars. And that's the main thing. You make money in a grocery chain, not just by selling product, but by buying product. And so there's a few ways about it. Grocery chains typically have slotting requirements where you have to pay to play in order to get on shelf. If you get approved by the category manager, they have a set fee. Usually it's either a certain dollar amount, or maybe it's a case per SKU per store. At Whole Foods, for us, it was a case per SKU per store, which we did on a de-escalator based on, if brands were more localized or ethical considerations. In addition, there are promotional and marketing fees for programs, and there is also the markdowns themselves, which gets even more complicated because there's different types of markdowns. So let's say you're a national supplier at like a Ahold division. Don't quote me on the exact amount, but like Ahold is primarily on the East Coast. You're probably giving them a slotting fee of a couple cases per SKU per store. So it's probably 30, 40 grand to get in. I know for some categories it's even more. It's not uncommon. And then they're going to be asking you for promotions. And Ahold is primarily self-distributing now. So there's a secondary complication here. We're talking about wholesale. We're just going to table that for the time being, because that's when things get a little wonky with understanding how the wholesalers work too. The quintessential, I don't mean to gender this, the quintessential middleman in the industry is the wholesale. Table that. So this are different types of promotions. So when you see something on sale in a grocery store, 2 for $5, regular price is $3.99. That difference between $3.99 and $2.50 is primarily funded by the brand, by the supplier, through different trade spend vehicles. Trade spend is accrual-based accounting, where on an annualized basis, you have a certain line item in your budget that you can spend this much money at your retail customers in order to promote. A promotion is just allocating a certain set amount of dollars on an item level basis using these various discounting methods. One being off invoice. Just very simple, elegant, but very risky too. Off invoice means take 20% off the invoice, flows through to the retail at 20% discount. And hopefully they reflect that on shelf and don't pocket the difference. The risk there is that you have to do it for a certain limited amount of time. And if you're a non-perishable item, you can get bridge bought or forward bought into oblivion. They could just buy a bunch of shit on promotion and just sell it at regular price after the promotion ends. Big risk. All right. The second kind of promotional vehicle is MCB, manufacturer chargeback. This protects the inventory and the discount at the retailer. It acts like an off invoice at the retailer, but it does not allow forward buying, doesn't incentivize forward buying at wholesale. However, the trick with MCBs is that wholesalers have figured out that they could bill back the supplier at a higher retail markup than what they charge to the retailer on the item. And the difference they pocket as incremental gross margin. So it's a profit center for the wholesaler. For the retailer, it just acts like an off invoice. And for the brand, it's a pain in the tuchus because they
Yeah.
end up sometimes paying 50 cents on the dollar for a 20% off promotion. And a lot of times they get pushed into this by different kinds of promotional requirements at the wholesaler or at the retailer. Like you got to do an MCB for slotting fees, for instance. All right. And so then the third kind of promotion, which is the most popular among suppliers, is a scan items where they grab the whole trade spend from a supplier and apply it against the cost of goods on an everyday basis.
Okay.
So they're not promoting. It's no more what we call those other promotions that we're talking about, high-low. It's just everyday low price so that you can hopefully compete on price. And, for the most part, those types of products are comp shopped, frequently so they know. So the reason why I'm bringing that up is that it lowers the retail price while protecting the gross margin of the retailer. Super important. So another way that retailers make money is through product differentiation, innovation. It's gotten more difficult for a few reasons, but I'll just say that when I was at Whole Foods, after a few years of national new product launches, new products, I think it was about 3 years in, were about 10% of our sales in grocery. So they had churned into snowballed into a really impactful program, which has helped us not only justify our jobs with what we were doing nationally, but also justify the way we were doing it, which was sort of mentor these local and regional brands into national partners that, leveraged Whole Foods first as a retailer before obviously soon jumping off into mass marketers like, Kroger and Walmart, which obviously hurt Whole Foods in the long run though. But in the meantime, that new product innovation helped set retailers apart. Now there's a dark side to that, and that is how aggressive retailers are with slotting fees. It's currently my theory, looking at a couple national retailers, that I think they make more money off of slotting fees than they do off of the new products themselves because they churn through those new products so quickly.
For sure.
My estimate is 60 to 70% attrition every 2 years at some of these chains now that are doing more aggressive category management and new product innovation. So I feel they've taken a good idea and turned it evil.
Yeah, I'll chime in on that. I mean, we've seen tens of thousands of dollars, right, spent on slotting fees in a store that also wants an EDLP or an EDLC, right? And the brand is on shelf for less than a year.
It's unethical.
I mean,
unethical.
Completely.
In fact, it should be illegal because it's double dipping. Can't be everyday low cost if you're also paying for slotting.
The specific situation that I'm thinking about where that existed, there was also extreme secrecy on the part of the distributor because the brand was getting billed back essentially, right? So we're selling to the distributor who distributes to a number of different retailers. So the product that sells through to the store, right, we're getting billed back essentially the difference on that EDLP. So we're paying, right? And but things seem weird. It seems like the price, as you were sort of hinting at, right? The difference, like the brand was being charged a bit more than what it seemed like the price to the retailer should have been. When we tried to straighten that out and say, hey, are you charging us back the right amount for this EDLP? Because it seems seems too low. We want to know what price you're selling the product at. We couldn't get any information. The store wouldn't tell us. The distributor wouldn't tell us.
Yeah.
So it's like, what is happening here? Then the sort of final straw was that stores were ordering product. It was on site at the distributors, regional distribution centers, but it wasn't getting out to store. So we were out of stock in a ton of places. And it was just this what seemed like a freak scenario that now is playing itself out, not to the full extent, but like 1 to 3 of those, cases exist at one time for multiple different brands where they're just being hit with all sorts of crap.
Yeah, it's Kafkaesque.
And the next thing you know, like, well, we can't carry you because not only can we not get your product in, but we're also going to compare your sales that are regional to the national movement of products in your category.
Look, I think the first thing from this story you're sharing is there's a lack of commitment to developing supplier relationships and long-term relationships. I'll give you an example, because we didn't always do it right at Whole Foods. I have saved plenty of the angry emails from suppliers who it didn't work out for or were abused within our system. Like, I'm not going to fetishize what we did at all. We tried to pay a little bit more attention, and we tried to correct things when we could. I'll say this, though. We had a couple of brands that we were able to develop into national suppliers. I used to call Siggy Hilmerson, Siggy Skier, a 7-year overnight success. We found him in Murray's Cheese. We made him a supplier in a couple stores in New York. We had enough scale. We made him a Northeast regional supplier, then North Atlantic. A couple years later, we moved him into a couple other regions. And I think it took 3 years before he was a national supplier. And then for the next 5 years, cultivated the relationship. He didn't always, Skier didn't perform as well as Greek yogurt, Faye, or then, the Chobani was like an asteroid. It was, just killed the dinosaurs. It was just a whole different type of velocity in the yogurt category. But we were like, Skier is unique. We also brought in the Icelandic Skier straight from Iceland. Let's continue to develop this zero sugar, low sugar, no sugar added, whatever that is, high protein, tastes like, Viking yogurt, and not discontinue it purely on the sales velocities. And then after about literally 6 or 7 years, he had some of the highest velocities in the category and was acquired by whoever now owns him, some French dairy co-op or whatever. And likewise, Justin's Nut Butter. It was another freaking nut butter. We didn't need another nut butter. Like, they convinced me. I was like his second customer. I was like, why do I need another nut butter? And, persistence, charm, he's kind of an adorable, 6'5" hippie. And Justin Gold, and we put it on shelf, cultivated over the course of a few years, even helped them find like nut supply. Like, they were spot buying, and we're like, why do your costs pretty good nut butter. I mean, and he did those packets, and then he did the confections, little nut butter cups. Yeah. So it just, over the course of several years, and I have one more example, which is Saffron Road, which is one of my favorite brands because it was the first time we actively tried to court Muslim consumers. They presented us a bunch of research that a lot of folks of Muslim heritage background were in our stores shopping, and we didn't have anything to serve them. We didn't have any halal food, but they were buying produce, they were buying bulk, they were buying organic. It was another one of those things where we took a gamble. I got death threats. I got emails sent to me saying, "You terrorist sympathizer." I'm Jewish, by the way, so I'm like, spare me. Over the course of like 6 years, we slowly cultivated this relationship with a frozen food brand. Frozen was very, very competitive, not a lot of space, high prices, and they turned into, by the time I left Whole Foods, one of our premier frozen entree. And then they expanded into all these other categories with a halal foods platform, kind of self-referential. They would, had a lot of humor about it. It was, for me, I was like, this is just Kosher for Muslims, it's not a big deal, folks. And it's great quality product. We help them buy ingredients. We help them source lamb. We help them buy chickpeas. So, we screwed up a lot. We did a lot of things wrong. We had a very imperfect system with this sort of regional national program. But what I think helps stand us apart was that we partnered closely with suppliers in these really deep ways over the long term. And then we found a supplier that met our values, and customers were obviously responding well to by buying their product. So I think those are some things I wanted to point out.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, and no, I don't know anyone in the industry who's trying to do anything remotely close to that, saying, let's cultivate this relationship. And I think you see that very clearly in how quickly a distributor will spread a brand like far and wide throughout their distribution centers, right? There's a lot of fees associated with that. Oh, you pay this much money to get, set up in each distribution center. I think knowing Farewell that they don't have the ability to sell through one distribution center really well, let alone 2, 3, you know what I mean? Or countrywide. So I think it's quite the opposite of what you're describing that we're seeing. And I had a conversation with the founder of Mabel, I need to follow up with him because he was talking about how, there needs to be sort of steps into distribution and a process. So you can go from self-distribution right into a national distributor and really have a program that will help the brand be successful, but also a distributor like KeHE, for example, to sort of get what they need from the relationship as well, because everyone is a business and every business needs to make money, and we all understand that. But how do we create some sort of systems and collaboration where everyone can succeed? I don't know where those conversations have gotten to. Like I said, I need to follow up with him, but
yeah,
I think there's a great divide. And like you said, on a bad day, you call Walmart different things. I think that our industry is corrupt.
Oh, it's legalized racketeering. And I think I'm going to jump in here because I'm not going to point fingers at the people who work in the industry, friends, family. I love the folks in the industry. I have nothing but love for the industry, but it's also like we need a scolding here because there are structural issues that we've not paid enough attention to, and that includes consolidation and scale and centralization, essentially monopsony power among a handful of retailers in many markets, consolidation at wholesale, driven by consolidation at retail, and then what we should really call legalized bribery through trade spend. What big CPG companies are able to do to maintain their dominance through paying slotting fees, paying those promotional fees, paying for retail media, paying for Instacart and online. And people are like, oh, how is this legal? I'm like, the FTC doesn't even know what I'm talking about. Guys, like I've talked to folks adjacent to the FTC. I've reached out. I've talked to the USDA. I said, you guys want to understand about wholesale? Let's talk about wholesale. It was all new to them. So it's like this stuff is legal because no one is banding together to say this does not work in our best interest. This works in their best interest. But let me say, like, I want to not make them out to be villains, though. Let me just explain this. This is about the consolidation and centralization. That's why I started out with Walmart. Walmart creates this pressure on cost across the industry. Right. Walmart was able to expand because of lack of enforcement of Sherman Antitrust and Robinson-Patman Antitrust Act. When I got my job at Whole Foods as national coordinator of grocery, VP grocery, they actually made me learn about Robinson-Patman. So I wasn't trying to leverage our scale to get better discounts. There had to be quid pro quo. We had to be fair to suppliers and not demand better costs just because we were now their biggest natural products customer, which is kind of a joke because even then Whole Foods is like less than 10% of business of most of these big national brands. Lack of enforcement of that has allowed bigger retailers and then larger wholesalers to do all these things. Now, the other side of this is the markups don't reflect the true cost of doing business in wholesale. So a cost plus markup of 6 or 7% for a Whole Foods or a Sprouts or it's 3 to 4% when Kroger is self-billing some of their own DCs. Like the cost of wholesale barely and most likely doesn't reflect the cost of doing wholesale business because wholesale, margins are 15 to 20%. Costco is a wholesaler, club store, it's a wholesaler. Costco takes a max margin of about 14 or 15 points. A good large-scale wholesaler is going to need that to run their business. But when they're charging their largest customers 6 or 7 points, they're going to have to make up for that 8 or 9 points through all these other programs, right? So that's one thing. So keep that in mind with wholesale. And then, wholesale is highly dependent on sales volume, delivery, frequency, location, distance. I mean, it's a whole algorithm for figuring out how to make wholesale profitable. But that's why you're having to pay all these chargebacks, billbacks, MCB upcharges, things that you need a forensic accountant. Now, the other side of this is retail. Retail markups. In order to do business as a retail, you need a 35 or 40% gross margin. That's it. Unless you're a mass merchant that's selling tires and apparel and electronics, you can margin up 25%. Trader Joe's is sort of a little in between. They're closer to 30 these days, I think. But they're EDLC and they're highly consolidated, highly centralized, small number of SKUs, Aldi, Trader Joe's. Well, these margins have to be met. And if you're having to compete on price, grocery stores essentially all sell a similar set of items these days. There's not a lot of variety. There's not really channels. Channels are things that data aggregators have created to, charge you to read the data as opposed to being actually in real life channels. No offense to my friends in the data world, but come on. Grocery stores, mass merchants, discounters, co-ops, there's not a large variety in what they sell anymore. So if you're a chain that has a 25% margin, you could sell milk at cost, whereas you're an independent that's not part of, like, say, a buying co-op like NCG, you need to margin up a bit more on milk or on high volume items just to keep the lights on, right? And that's most apparent in, like, independent convenience stores like bodegas. Why are they so expensive? Well, unless they're part of a buying co-op, and there's actually one here in Austin called Gamma, a buying co-op, wholesale buying co-op for convenience stores, helps them stay more competitive on price on Coke and Doritos and what convenience stores sell. So this is some of the math behind these practices. There is this financial pressure, this race to the bottom, this all-consuming void that is creating these pressures on the personnel, on their P&Ls, to implement these types of business policies that just suck and suck the life out of the industry and make it not fun, very difficult to sell into the industry. And yet, I also want to say, yet you still see thousands of new brands come out every year. So it's like,
I think because they don't know what they're getting into.
Everybody thinks they're going to be mayor. Everybody thinks they're going to have the big exit, but attrition, 60, 70%.
Back the egg article, I think we'll link to it in the show notes because it's talking specifically about eggs, but the example is what you kind of touched on very briefly. The big mass market brands, right? They're not having the same margins tacked on to their product as a small brand is, based on velocity and all of the kind of things that go into how do we determine this. So it's one knock against the smaller brands. And I think for me, the reason I got into food is because the majority of items sold in a grocery store hurt my body. My story is acne, really painful acne from eating food that I thought was good, but was highly processed and had things in it that really messed me up. So if I'm going to walk around without a face full of acne and with my body feeling good, then I have to eat real food. That doesn't exist in the grocery store necessarily. It exists in the farmer's market. So I did a full swing, all farmer's market, then I think as a pendulum does, when it goes really hard one direction, it sort of comes back to the middle and you say, okay, I can't spend every day. It's easy when you work in the farmer's market, right? To literally, eat and breathe that food and to have that fill your home. But when you get out of that, then you realize the difficulties of getting the access to this type of food. So then if I'm like the majority of Americans who needs to shop at a grocery store, how do I get the food that I want in the grocery store, right? Then fast forward to the role that I'm in now, looking at the finances, trying to help brands strategize to successfully and financially get their product to as many consumers as possible. And we see roadblock after roadblock after roadblock, and this need for a ton of money and financial investment and funding, even at a regional level in many cases. And it's like, how do we do this in a way where it doesn't have to be so expensive for the brand, right? How do we do this in a way? Is there a model that could exist where the way a retailer makes their money is different than how they're having to do it now? Or are we just so far gone because of the Walmarts of the world that it's just we can't turn it around? We're just, this is where we're at until there are laws in place.
Well, I mean, I honestly think that this needs to happen on a public and civil level, especially for folks who want to do this for a living, who want to work in the industry or want to create brands, or they want to fill a customer need. They want to service, folks like you and me who have particular dietary preferences and needs. I think that there needs to be some boundaries, some framework over the types of practices in the industry. But I think it starts with, I think we need to enforce antitrust law. It's as if they're not enforcing traffic laws and you can just drive as fast as you want. I mean, that's really all it is. It's just like if you were to actually enforce Robinson Patman or Sherman antitrust, and I kind of gave a list of this in my last article, and I'm not a lawyer. I mean, I'm not a regulator. But I've talked to a few folks who know that stuff a little well. In fact, a couple of them even called or emailed me to say, hey, you may want to clarify the way you communicate this, blah, blah, blah. I think that's the first place to start, because unless you have some framework around this, big fish is going to eat the small fish. This isn't going to be about survival of the fittest, and the biggest is going to win every time. Yeah. And that's what you have now. It is so commonplace. It is so cyclical and regular what you're experiencing or brands are experiencing, that it's taken for granted that that's how it is. But that's not how it should be or how it could be. But in order to change it, folks have to, as the playwright Bertolt Brecht actually said, the job of a citizen is to keep their mouths open.
I love that. I was talking to somebody last night who said, well, we have this way and of doing business, and they were referring to trade spend. And, he said, I won't say this publicly, and I said, hold on a second. You absolutely need to say that publicly. The part of the problem here, part of the lack of there being a solution, is that people aren't saying enough publicly about what they're experiencing or how they're, negotiating and being successful, right? Like, we need shared information.
Yeah.
I think, transparency doesn't exist in this industry. And so the people who are trying to build businesses, who are uncovering these practices and roadblocks to growth and success, you gotta share them. You gotta talk about them.
Oh, absolutely. I just don't know what people are so scared of. It's like open secrets. Everybody knows what's going on. Everybody talks about it. Everybody gets beers after their supplier meeting or their vendor meetings there with the category manager. I think there should be more openness, and not on a level of like personal attacks or anything, but in terms of institutional change, like, hey, these are commonplace practices that should be disallowed, that need a lot more scrutiny. Like I've been saying, like, just start enforcing some of the law, but then also the folks who are, in regulatory need to get with it and actually understand how the industry functions and how moving these things around will have other knock-on effects too. I'm not just saying, hey, if you do one or two things here, it's going to fix everything. And I think the big reason why I keep coming back to is the consolidation. It's one of the reasons why within 18 hours after I heard about a potential Kroger-Albertsons merger, I had pumped out a 1,500-word piece saying, no way, this cannot be allowed to happen, because it would compound more and more of these issues. And that's, I almost did the same thing with Aldi and Harvey Winn-Dixie, but it was more regionalized, and they're still going up against Publix in that area. So for those folks who think I'm maybe being inconsistent, I do see that as a problem, but not to the level of Kroger-Albertsons, where you're taking 10% of the grocery industry, adding it to 6% of the grocery industry, and even with some spin-offs, you're still close to 15%, which would be
Yeah.
number 2 to Walmart, which when you add in Walmart, Kroger, Albertsons, Costco, and Ahold, it's almost 60% of all groceries sold would be in the top 4. So all these practices, everything that we're talking about here, would be further cemented as status quo, as opposed to creating, more competition among the retailers, but also more ways for brands to come into the marketplace,
Mm-hmm.
because it's very hard now. You need a lot of capital just to launch into grocery, and that's not fair. And that's
Yeah.
also not healthy to the food system, and it's not healthy to the food industry that you have such a high cost of entry just to, get your product on shelf in a reasonable number of stores and make a living doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. At this point, I'm a huge champion of regional food businesses because financially I've seen a number of them be successful doing things like I call right sizing.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a couple conversations here on the podcast about the lack of infrastructure as well being a big barrier.
Did you listen to my last podcast with Matriarch Foods? We talked about regional
No, I
processing
haven't.
infrastructure. We're on the same page as usual. Yeah.
I'll listen to it, but
Yeah.
yeah, so it's like, okay, if you're successful at this size, right, and there's a huge gap to getting to that next level, quote unquote, right, or a few levels above, I think one of the things I try to tell people is like, it's okay to be smaller. It's okay to stay
Mm-hmm.
regional. We can create a business model that works where you can be profitable, where you can still achieve volume that produces margin, cash flow, everything else that you need to earn a living from this business, if that's your goal. Because I think that for me, I we need regional food, right? Farmers markets are a really important part of the food industry and infrastructure. I think that I want to support my regional tortilla company and my regional pasta brand that I buy from, not only because the quality is so amazing, but also because jobs, because the
Yeah.
local economy benefits from those jobs existing. And with
Yes.
all of the difficulty there is in becoming a national brand, it's not that I say no one should be a national brand because we need good food at all levels, but I think many businesses, I hope that the founders will start to rethink, hey, maybe I don't need to grow to this size that's celebrated in the media. Maybe I can be a regional champion and make money and do good.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of mythology about that. The only reason why, and I love Vital Farms. I think the eggs are great, but the only reason it became a national brand is the CEO is friends with John Mackey and didn't let any of the regions discontinue them for other regional egg brands. So, you know, I could give examples about a lot of national brands like that. Like I said, why is Siggy's a national brand? It's because Whole Foods literally subsidized and supported their brand. Like, didn't apply our exacting category review standards just to give them time to grow because they were so, it was
Right.
unique. So I think there's a lot of mythology about that, and I think there's a lot of mythology like the VC community has peddled too about like quick exits to strategics who, by the way, will always gut your company. They will always gut it. You saw it with RX Bar. Kellogg's, laid off most of the RX Bar employees within a couple of years after the acquisition. I mean, Campbell's changed up the whole supply chain for Pacific Foods within, I think months after the acquisition, and changed some of the formulas as well. I mean, I can go time and time and time again. I think what you're saying is right on. I call it like narrow and deep or concentric circles.
Yeah.
To go after like your core market and just fill ACV, fill distribution gaps as dense as possible and build out from there. And if you want to go to another market, it's kind of like, puddle jumping. It's like, okay, where's the next puddle? Then you do the same thing there. But this whole notion of getting into a national chain and just going national and scaling up, getting gobbled up by Mars, Nestle, Pepsi, mythology, folks. And by the way, you look at what Coke has done the last few years. They killed honesty. They buried honesty. They buried Zico. They buried Adwala. Right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's gone.
dang.
So I think what you're saying is right on. And, especially if you do it in a way that, you can make a living and you could create a profitable company and, you're not exploiting people, underpaying people, using prison labor, child labor that, you know,
Yeah.
I just wrote an article about like Tyson is using child labor. You know, it's like, why
I
is
read that
Tyson so
one.
profitable? You know, not only do they exploit these folks in their facilities, so it's like there's this whole mythology, and it's not based in the math, and you're giving them some good math tools to do it right. So that's great.
You know, Errol, I wish that you and I got together and we like had this is the this is the answer. This is the solution. Now everything is different. I know we want that. And I encourage all of our listeners to check out the checkout and also your articles. I know a lot of them get published in Forbes. A lot of them are linked to the checkout website as well.
Yes.
So definitely go and read those and pay attention to the grocery nerd on Instagram too.
Yeah, I don't do too much on social media because it stresses me out. It's very predatory. But if folks ever have questions, I'm easily accessible. Like my website, my Errol Schweizer LLC, where I, for consulting, advisory, board work that I do, you can write me there.
Can you talk about that a little bit? What does that type of work look like?
I have a couple different things that I specialize in. I work with retailers on pricing, merchandising strategies, assortment. I've also done a lot of board work for retailers, so I can help them with operations and pretty much anything. For brands, I've worked as a board member advisor on pretty much the same thing, the other side of the table: supply chain, pricing strategy, promotional strategy. I've helped do a lot of new product development. I've even helped with some e-commerce, and then some marketing and branding as well. And I've worked with probably 25 brands since I left Whole Foods, and a half dozen retailers. I've also done some advisory consulting, due diligence work for some investors. So yeah, I that's mostly what I spend my time on. I'm not like a full-time media person. Like I still got to make a living. And right now I'm on the board of several companies, advising a few others. And the other thing that I've started working on, which I'm feeling really passionate about, is sustainability benchmarking based on some of these new financial sustainability standards. So that's through Impakt IQ, which is investor grade sustainability benchmarking, and give them a shout out. They're also based up in the Bay Area, and wonderful folks, kind of world leading program that's, I think, a little ahead of its time. And sort of, you have all these different sustainability markers, B Corp, fair trade, organic, non-GMO, but they're not based in the same currency. And what this is doing is looking at all of them in a holistic manner and saying, if you're doing all these things right, you should be getting a higher grade by investors. Right. In addition to the fact that that's what the consumer wants. It's how many studies do we need to read that consumers want this stuff more and more? And the more of these sort of ethical, sustainable certifications you have, the better their sales are, the better their stickiness is. And that's what we've seen over the last couple decades. So working on creating that level of benchmarking and assessment, and once again, transparency, is something else that I've been spending a lot of time on. So yeah.
That's really cool. That's awesome. Well, I don't want our time to end, but I want to respect our schedules and things we need to do. Thanks for hanging out with me for over an hour today.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, I'd love to continue the conversation at some point in the future. We'll keep reading your articles and sharing them. And again, just thanks for the work that you do. I think it's important. I think your ideas are really interesting and valuable as a way to try to navigate the future of what, the food landscape can look like and what feeding people well can look like. So thank you for that.
For more content like this and connection with other food founders and industry experts, join us inside the Good Food CFO community. Just visit thegoodfoodcfo.com/join to learn more.
Thank you for joining us here today. If you enjoyed this episode or found it helpful or inspiring in any way, please share it with your founder friends on social and rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. It's the #1 way to help good food founders find the show. We'll be back with a brand new episode next week.